Cornel West, a philosopher and civil rights icon, was on CNN this week to discuss the protests and the riots and the situation that's going on right now. And he had some very powerful words to say.
In deep sadness, because I've been trying to bear witness for over 53 years, telling the truth and trying to say something about the least of these. But I think we are witnessing America as a failed social experiment. And what I mean by that is that the history of black people for over 200 and some years in America has been looking at America's failure. Its capitalist economy could not generate and deliver in such a way that people could live lives of decency. The nation state, its criminal justice system, its legal system could not generate protection of rights and liberties. And now our culture, of course, is so market driven, everybody for sale, everything for sale. It can't deliver the kind of really real nourishment for soul, for meaning, for purpose. And so when you get this perfect storm of all of these multiple failures at these different levels of the American empire, and Martin King already told us about that. When I saw those pictures there in Atlanta, you could see Martin right there in Atlanta saying, I told you about militarism, I told you about poverty, I told you about materialism, I told you about racism in all of its forms, whatever forms it takes. I told you about xenophobia. And what we've seen in America is now these chickens coming home to roost. You're reaping what you sow. And in this instant, you have Brother George, where it is so clear it is a lynching at the highest level. Nobody can deny it. And I thank God that we have people in the streets. Can you imagine this kind of lynching taking place and people are indifferent? People don't care? People are callous? You have just a few people out there with signs. I recall the moments in which during the Reagan years, there was a few of us out there. In the 60s, you had masses out there. Now you've got a younger generation of all of these different colors and genders and sexual orientations saying, we won't take it any longer. But you know what's sad about it though, brother? At the deepest level? It looks as if the system cannot reform itself. We've tried black faces in high places. Too often our black politicians, professional class, middle class, become too accommodated to the capitalist economy, too accommodated to the militarized nation state, too accommodated to the market-driven culture tied with celebrity status, power, fame, all of that superficial stuff that means so much to so many fellow citizens. And what happens? What happens is we got a neo-fascist gangster in the White House who really doesn't care for the most part. You got a neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party that is now in the driver's seat with the collapse of Brother Bernie. And they don't really know what to do because all they want is show more black faces, show more black faces. But oftentimes these black faces are losing legitimacy too because the Black Lives Matter movement emerged under a black president, black attorney general, and black Homeland Security, and they couldn't deliver, you see? So that when you talk about the masses of black people, the precious poor and working class black people, poor and working class brown, red, yellow, whatever color, they're the ones who are left out and they feel so thoroughly powerless, helpless, hopeless, then you get rebellion. And we've reached the point now, it's a choice between nonviolent revolution. And by revolution, what I mean is the democratic sharing of power, resources, wealth, and respect. If we don't get that kind of sharing, you're going to get more violent explosions. Now, the sad thing is, at this neo-fascist moment in the White House, you got some neo-fascist brothers and sisters out there who are already armed. They show up there at the U.S. Capitol, and they don't get arrested. They don't get put down.
So I think there's a lot that needs to be unpacked from that video. But the thing that stuck with me the most is that his statement that the system fundamentally cannot reform itself. And that's what this crisis is showing, right? It's showing that previous examples of peaceful protests against police brutality, protests that fall within the legal spectrum of the current system, did not enable the kind of reform that was needed to prevent George Floyd from dying. Those peaceful protests that took place within the legal limits of the system did not solve the problems of the system, right? The economic injustice that Cornel West talks about continues up to this day. Injustice that has been known about for decades. Injustice that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about in the 60s, more than 50 years ago, that still hasn't been solved today. Things that have been discussed within the framework of the system. People have voted time and time again for new politicians, and things still haven't changed. Right? MLK's warnings about militarism, capitalism, greed, racism, xenophobia, all of these things, almost all of them seem epitomized by who's in the White House right now. Right? But Donald Trump isn't a sole example, because all of those things have been continuing, mostly under the rug, but now they're much more explicit under this president, who doesn't mind holding up the Bible and claiming that we need some strong show of force and a restoration of law and order to bring peace back to America's streets. What needs to be done to bring peace back to America's streets is to change the system, to defund police, to make these reforms that are necessary to fundamentally restructure society to make lives for those at the bottom better. And I think the most absurd thing, which is something that he talks about, that also shows that the system can't reform itself because it's biased inherently, is that look how the anti-quarantine protesters were treated. How those neo-fascist protesters, the one who stormed the office of the Michigan governor with rifles, how they were treated. They were treated extremely well. But now we have unarmed protesters, and they're often shot for no reason, pepper sprayed for no reason, tear gassed for no reason. It's because people who stand against what the system stand on, these issues of racism and capitalism, will be treated poorly by that system because the system doesn't and cannot reform itself. That's the issue that's coming up now with these protests, that has existed for decades upon decades. And I think what's very clear now is that people are acting up not just because of police brutality and not just because of George Floyd, but because there's a desperate economic situation now that the government has fundamentally not been able to address. While Wall Street has gotten bailouts in the trillions, we're facing 20 to 30% unemployment for the average American. And they're supposed to be satisfied with a $1,200 blank check and some unemployment benefits while Wall Street gets trillions in bailouts? I mean, just look at the stock market. It's doing completely fine while Main Street and the regular economy has crashed. The system has become detached from reality. Right? I mean, and if it's bad now, like, there are many states that put in place laws saying that evictions can't happen now, even if rents aren't paid. So probably as soon as the pandemic close down ends officially in most of the states, those laws will expire, meaning that we're going to have a massive wave of of evictions, because people haven't been able to pay rent because they haven't made any money. And so we're going to have an even more massive homeless problem than we've ever had before. People know that this is the problems that they could be facing, and they're demanding a change. I mean, our economy is just simply not working for those at the bottom, right? Again, and there's a racial lens as well. Black people are disproportionately part of that lower class that is systematically oppressed, right? Blacks are disproportionately affected by coronavirus because they often live in poor and tightly packed urban parts of the country. I mean, there's just so much wrong that's going on right now. And that's the reason people are out there. And it's not just about, just a person's material standard of living. How Cornel West talks about how black people haven't, and, not black people and anybody really who's at the bottom right now, it just isn't able to have what's provided for them aptly under the capitalist system, to have a good life provided for them. It's also about the mental and the spiritual strain that our current system puts on people, right? With this constant commoditized, high pressure world that we live in. And I mean, that contributes to such a wide array of mental health problems, that we have a mental health crisis in this country, and we don't have a mental health system that is strong enough to adapt to it. And I mean, that's just another one of the many flaws that are present in the system, right? People can't just not, they don't have enough for the material conditions of life, but they also don't have enough for the spiritual and how to sustain themselves mentally and things like that. And I think that's an aspect Cornel West talks about that often isn't discussed and should be talked about more. And so I think what Cornel West says clearly here is that, again, it's not just black faces in high places, right? These problems happened under the Obama administration, our first black president, right? It's not just about that, because it's not about individuals. It's about the system. It's macro, not micro. It's everybody. And so I think what the demands are, and what the demands are rightfully calling for, is for a fundamental restructuring of society. Economic justice, UBI, Medicare for all, whatever you think is the best way to address these injustices. Defunding the police, replacing the police with nonviolent, more mental health oriented organizations that attack issues at the root, right? I talked about this in my last video. The reason we have these riots is and these damages is not because of the rioters themselves, but because of the conditions that caused the riots to happen. That's the issue. If we want to fight crime in this country, maybe instead of shoving guns down the throats of people, we should talk about why crime is happening in the first place. People don't steal food because they want to. People steal food because they need to feed their families. I mean, I think that's the problem that's not being discussed now. And I think that's a problem that this law and order perspective is never going to be able to address. So, I think there's so much more to it than just that, but keep yourselves informed, guys, and please stay safe and help out however you can. Just like with the last video, I'm going to make sure to include information for donations for important organizations during this time. But otherwise, take care, and I'll see y'all later.